Welcome to the C Word, the Conservators podcast. Today we're talking about military collections. I'm Jenny Mathiasson, an objects conservator based in South Yorkshire.
And I'm Kloe Rumsey, an objects conservator based in Greater Manchester.
Yeah, and today we've got a special guest host. Vicky, would you like to introduce yourself?
My name's Vicky Singleton. I'm the Conservation Manager at the National Army Museum.
Very snazzy.
Hello, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So I can't think of a better person to talk to about military stuff.
No.
So I was just going to start us off with a bit of like what our experiences are around the table. Should I go first?
You should go first.
Okay, I'll go first. I'm going to start with, I have no military background. And this, I feel, is something that might come up. Because, right, so people who don't know, I was born in Sweden. Now, Sweden has had military conscription, pretty much mandatory for males since 1901, with some gaps here and there.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, with some gaps here and there. But we didn't have any like direct involvement with World War One or Two because we were supposedly neutral. And that tends to mean that people... I mean, I don't have that unique connection with the world wars because I can't say my grandfather fought in that and like my great granddad did that thing. Like I can't say those things, which means that I don't have an automatic buy-in in a lot of the military history in Britain, which makes that a surprisingly difficult subject sometimes. That being said, I should probably point out that Sweden isn't devoid of military history. We have something like 40 to 50 military museums in Sweden.
But that sounds like a lot.
And we do have a lot of military history. That being said, I don't personally feel particularly connected to it. But I have volunteered at regimental museums and I work at one now. So I do actually work quite a bit with military collections, which is something that surprises me as much as anyone, because I felt that I was kind of being thrown in at the deep end because basically where I work now, it's a museum that has been merged with a regimental museum. And that means that we are essentially two museums sort of operating as one, but having two names. It's a little bit complicated. And that means that part of my collection is also a military collection. And I did not know what I was getting into, having never held a gun, etc., that sort of thing. Which is something that we talked about in the Danger episode, where we talked to Lead Royal Armouries about guns and firearms and all that stuff, right? So it's been a steep learning curve, an enjoyable one, but a bit intense. Anyone else?
Well, I suppose I feel like I'm often in this podcast the person who either disagrees or doesn't know anything and is asking loads of stupid questions. So I sort of just actively don't like military collections, but I think that is because I just have a sort of political impatience with war and attitudes to war. And I don't think that really links up with how I feel about memorials or, you know, the actual people or how military collections fit into social history.
But it's complicated.
It's kind of complicated. I know that wars have in this country have been very important to social history. And I know that military collections are just another form of social history. But I sort of, you know, it's the gun thing. I just go, oh, whatever, kind of thing. I just have no patience with it. And that's, I mean, thank God I've never been presented with a military collection because I'd have to really change my views on that.
Fair enough.
But yeah, so I'm looking forward in this episode, I think, to talking to Vicky about what it's like working with a military collection and also different attitudes to military collections that we're going
to take you on a ride.
Yeah, exactly. I'm interested to have my horizons broadened because I don't think being just sort of disregarding of it a whole type of object collection is healthy at all.
That's also fair. That's also fair. All right, Vicky.
So I'd volunteered at museums that certainly had military collections in them previously, but starting my job at the National Army Museum was the first time I'd worked. Yeah, it was the first military museum I'd worked at anyways, and I felt the same as you, Jenny. Like, I don't have a military background. I don't have, you know, I haven't studied military history. I was a little bit concerned when I started the job because I was a bit naive and I was like, oh gosh, like I worked in a natural history museum before.
Yeah.
No. I was like, oh my goodness, I'm going to be working with, going from working with taxidermy and skeletons, which I feel very comfortable with, to working with swords and firearms and medals, and I won't I'm not going to know anything. And I was quite nervous, but I was also quite naive because the collection is so diverse and there's so many transferable materials and objects between the different collections types that you kind of, you have to think about more the materials rather than the actual kind of like the collection. But I was definitely slightly nervous when I started, and like you, like I'd never held a firearm before. Yeah. And I had to, every year that I'm working at NAM, I learn more, and I have a better understanding of these objects, and that's a really nice feeling. But so my main experience of working with military museums, to summarise, is at the National Army Museum.
I think you're really onto something there, because I was initially terrified. But as soon as you start breaking something down into, it's just these materials and this particular configuration, then it starts feeling a little bit less intimidating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think any conservator who goes into a new place of work actually has that reaction. If it's a collection they're not like super intimately familiar with. And I mean, you certainly get it with social history all the time, because social history is so vastly different at each place you go to. So actually, it's a very natural reaction for us all to be a little bit nervous. And then just kind of conquering those fears by starting to look hang on, I know what to do with metal. This is just metal in a tube that is meant to fire something, but it's fine, and I made sure it's safe and everything's fine. And it's just about thinking those things through.
About industrial collections, actually, when I started working with, when I started my previous place, started working with industrial collections, because obviously it's moving parts, it does a thing, it's made out of these things, and these are the safety concerns.
Yeah, exactly.
That's your...
I thought we'd have a quick chat about the different types of military museums that you find in the UK, because there's a bewildering array. And as someone who is not intimately familiar with military structure, it gets worse. Because we've got so first of all,
God, does it bring military structure into it as well?
Well, yeah, because so we've got.
I'm cracking my fingers. I'm getting my brain in gear.
So aside from obviously museums who just happen to have a bit of military social history, just kind of randomly,
social history.
Yeah, we've got service branch specific museums. So that's things like the RAF. And the Navy, and then you get in very broadly kind of specific. We've got the big nationals, because they tend to be ones that are just called the National Museum of Blank, for example. And then we've got ships can be museums, so they're floating museums. And whatever's attached to that. Great
Britain, etc.
And then obviously we've already strayed into regimental museums, which tends to obviously be for a specific regiment, which means there are loads of those, because there are loads of little regiments. And they're not all active ones. They are sometimes ones that have come out of active service that don't exist anymore, but people served in them, so people have a connection to them. And it's all, there's so many layers. There are so many types.
I actually hadn't thought of it like that. But when you start with, obviously the RAF, yeah. I can wrap my head around that.
But then I think this probably stems from me not having an appreciation of how incredibly many parts there is to, say, just the armed forces of Britain, because there's so much going on, and I just don't have a genuine kind of overview of how many different branches and regiments and all that stuff that makes up the armed forces. And each one can have a museum, and often does have a museum, and they can be huge and they can be tiny and they can be part of another museum, and it's an amazing array, really.
So is the structure of the armed forces something that you've had to make yourself aware of, as well as the object types?
It's something that I'm just constantly learning about, to be honest. And if I have questions, I'll ask curators about the structure. It's not something I'm intimately familiar with by any means, and I'm constantly having to ask questions about.
Because there is a lot to take in.
I think I'm getting that now.
And then we almost stray into the kind of territory of jargon, which...
so many acronyms.
Oh, God, yeah. So many acronyms. So many. There are a lot of different ranks depending on which branch you served in and all that stuff. And obviously changes over history as well, to some degree. So I feel like I could really do with a dummy's guide to the entire British military system. That would be great. But I haven't found that yet. So if anyone knows of anything, that's a really good overview of like from, say, just the 1600s to now. That'd be great. And if that doesn't exist, please write one. Just please, I need it.
Like the actual objects as well themselves have very particular names for every part of them.
I mean, just the different bits of a sword.
I was just thinking of swords actually. I just last
and then
week...
different kinds of swords are called different things.
I mean, right. What is a saber? Why is it different to a sword? I don't want this to be like, question time or anything, but I just did a condition report for 2 swords that we were referring to as sabers. Then we saw that actually they were accessioned as swords, and we were like, where did the word saber come from? Where did we drag that one from? I've got no idea. And then I looked it up online, and they were called both in different situations.
Oh, yeah, and sometimes you just get things that are simultaneously called 2 things.
Yeah, I don't get it.
It's mind-boggling, and sometimes I just have to rely on the wisdom of other people around me who can tell me. I do feel slightly like people do tend to get quite annoyed at me for not knowing these things.
Oh, really?
Yes, and there's also an assumption, I feel, because we're a military museum, there's a certain assumption of knowledge, which we're trying to get out of in terms of how we write our interpretation and stuff. Because there's kind of an assumption that if you go here, that means that you were probably part of this regiment or you're related to someone who was. And suddenly that becomes the thing. So we're going to talk to you in this very specific way, where we're not going to explain what a theatre of war is. And we're not going to explain what this particular bit of equipment actually does, because it's so obvious to us and it must be obvious to you.
Oh, I see.
And then you start putting up a barrier where people go into your museum and they feel stupid and they feel like they're not learning anything. And this can translate to staff. Hello. Because there's a lot of this feeling like, well, why are you even touching this if you don't know what it's called? Well, kind of because it's my job, and also because you guys could share. You could share that knowledge with me. But jargon is something that's almost kind of closely guarded because it's so part of military kind of the way of speaking, the way of communicating. And it is supposed to be very obvious because you're supposed to be in the know-how. But that's not how perhaps a generic museum visitor might see it, if you see what I mean. So I think it's a journey that many military museums that I've been to are on, to kind of take things from a very jargony and kind of very expertise-driven kind of way of speaking to making it more accessible and making people, maybe bringing people into a new knowledge, which I find really interesting, actually. And it's really heartening to see, because it does mean that someone like me can rock up to a military museum and feel like I'm here to learn something today. I'm not here to go away feeling like there's no point because I didn't know what a theatre of war was. So I lost the entire context of the entire museum and then I left.
Is that what you found in your museum, Vicky?
My museum went through a big redevelopment. It reopened in 2017, and one of the aims of that redevelopment was making the displays more accessible for an audience. And so I think we've kind of we've had a massive project to try and do that already, and sort of heading in that direction. And now there's it's kind of finding a balance between, satisfying those visitors who know what they're talking about and really then making it accessible to the wider audience as well. And that's a really difficult balance to find, I think.
It is a very difficult balance, and I always try to assure people when I do make this argument that maybe we could try to explain this in a different way, that I'm not saying stop using the word. I'm just trying to say maybe explain it first. Or maybe even have a glossary or something that I can pick up.
So I'm really interested now, actually, from a recent experience in working with veterans. So though I have said, I'm not interested in military collections, one of the most wonderful projects I've had to do, actually, possibly in my whole career, is mount 4 now military flags, standards, that are owned by veterans in Wrexham museums. And they actually visited and saw the objects, and it was just saw the objects in situ being treated with the respect of museum objects. And it was a surprisingly emotional experience all around. And they were in uniform. They bought their fourth standard, because it was 3 at the time, and then the fourth standard that was in use at the time for photography and stuff. And they were talking about all the previous people that they were in service with. And I was amazed at how sort of emotionally charged everything was. And that was the thing that brought the social history aspect of it home to me. And I was wondering, Vicky, is there a sort of programme of events for veterans in your museum?
Yeah, so we're based next to the Chelsea Royal Hospital. And so we've got really good links with the veteran community there. And we have various events that go on throughout the year. And with regimental museums as well, you do get a lot of veterans in those museums. I personally will provide advice for individuals that will get in contact with you with how they would like to, it's often questions about storing their own kind of personal items, or potentially they might be interested in how they would proceed if they wanted to get something conserved. Also talking to regimental museums about options they have going forward with storage and conservation. Yeah, but the museum has a lot of links with those communities. Not just veterans either, like people who are still in the army and regiments, current regiments and soldiers. There's a lot of links between the two, which is a positive, because you can, draw stories from their experiences. And
it makes me think that, so yours is obviously a very much a kind of a living museum, in that it collects now as well, like things from current soldiers as well. We as a kind of a regimental museum, we mostly collect things from, there's still stories of people's fathers and grandfathers, that sort of thing. And obviously we've still got these people coming in and sharing their stories with us, and that's fantastic. So we do get donations still. But I think the main way that people actually engage with our collection is actually not so much the objects, although we do get plenty of requests for people to see objects donated by their family members and stuff like that. But actually we get a lot of interaction with our archives, because the Borough's archive is also a regimental archive and sits on site with us, which is really valuable. And people come in all the time doing family research, trying to figure out, where their, grandfather or great-grandfather went in the wars and what they did, and like all of these pieces of paper that are so important to them as a person. And it's an astonishing amount of people coming in and sharing stories and discovering more about themselves or their families just through kind of research on an archival basis, which is really nice.
Yeah, we have the same. We've got the Templar Study Centre, which is the on-site study and research for access to archives, and it's the same. Like lots of interest and visitors coming in and working in the reading room, kind of like looking up their past or their family's past, or it's a really positive connection with that community.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Well, shall we enter into the murky waters of ethics, perhaps? Oh, don't do that face at me.
Hey, I love ethics. I'm rolling up my sleeves.
Excellent. Well, how about the ethics of, say, collecting? I mean, I think military museums, they kind of have a duty to collect all these stories and things, I feel, because otherwise they are lost. But then is that not a duty of every single museum ever? Collect stories unless they are lost?
I think that's the duty of every museum. I suppose I wonder how much sort of this is very emotionally charged.
Yeah,
I'm guessing.
Yes,
there's no easy story.
No, of course. I mean, and I think there's a unique kind of level of emotional investment in military museums which you don't necessarily see everywhere else. Like people are passionate in all museums, they are. But maybe the level of emotional investment almost from the public might be quite significantly larger in a military museum, depending on if it's, within living memory, etc. If it's like a current collecting, it can get very emotional to kind of, because military collections challenge people. They do. And I think that's actually a good thing. It stimulates conversation. It can make people think about sacrifices of the past. It can make people question things now. And I think that's really valuable. And it's something that I love asking people in job interviews. What would you do if a museum visitor was very upset by the fact that we're displaying weapons?
Yes, that's a really interesting question. Actually, I want to hear from both of you. Have you had the situation where you've had a visitor come up to you, or you've had, an email saying, we've had a complaint about how this is displayed. Someone thinks it's not sensitive.
No,
You have not.
but then bearing in mind, and I'm going to be slightly presumptuous and say that the same is probably true for Vicky's museum. We advertise what we are. You have to choose to go in, and you kind of know what you're buying into. It's like nobody would go into their museum of human remains and then be sad that they saw human remains, right? Would you go into a military museum and then be upset that you have seen a weapon? I feel like you would be hard pushed to make that argument that you were upset by it. That being said, I'm sure something can have been done insensitively, sure. But I guess because the buy-in is there, you are entering a military museum, then I think there's a certain level of maybe preparation in terms of the visitor's mind that, okay, I'm going into a military museum. This is what I expect. No, is my answer.
Okay.
Yeah, so far anyway. But I love asking people the question.
No, my answer's the same. I haven't had any visitors express that to me. I'd be interested to talk to our visitor experience staff to see if they have, but I agree with Jenny. People are coming in knowing what they're looking at, and also, I strongly believe that everything in the museum is displayed very sensitively and kind of like, taking, isn't displayed inappropriately at all. So, I hope nobody would ever be offended by anything they've come in to look at. So,
yeah. So I think that might be where the balance is there. Oh, and of course. So we're talking about displaying things, and I'm completely okay with displaying things, including weapons that have been used. Perfectly fine with that. If anything, I think it adds authenticity to display clothing that has clearly been torn, or I feel like it's completely okay to display what is real. I would feel a lot less comfortable if we were displaying things that weren't real, if you see what I mean.
Replicas and
I feel like unless there's a certain level of reenactment, which I might be able to which I'm going to talk more about later, I feel like what you display has to be genuine, and that's the rule. But I feel like it's completely okay to display, like we have, a trench helmet that has clearly had a hole in it.
Oh yeah, well that's so.
Like someone ended their days with that on it.
How do you manage? Question to both of you again. How do you manage reactions to that? Because I feel as though the reaction that adults and museums probably want to encourage in that is, oh goodness, how sort of poignant.
Or, oh, is that real?
Or, oh, is that real? Yes, but the sort of maybe the 12-year-old boy reaction. Apologies for being sexist. Maybe 12-year-old. I mean, I don't know. Oh my god, that's so cool. Yeah, it would be. Oh, awesome! That's amazing. Oh, look, somebody's brains exploded out of that hole. Like, how do you encourage a thoughtful reaction?
You ultimately can't.
You can't. Okay.
Like, all you can do is frame things. But ultimately, if someone wants to take away from that, that's so cool that I saw a helmet where someone's brains have been blown out, then fine. But, then that is still a reaction, and that might still be a memory that they have. That might still be a memory that makes them, I don't know, that impacts them in some way later in life. I mean, it's not up to me to say what's a good reaction from a museum exhibition.
It's usually it'll be some kind of emotional reaction, won't it? Whether it's somebody's sad about what they're looking at, or they're angry about what they're looking at, or it makes them go away and think about it for weeks. They might never think about it again, but you can't control that emotion that somebody's going to feel when they see that object.
Yeah, and it can go either way. Life. And it's perfectly all right. It's much more worrying to me if people come out completely unfazed.
It's true.
It's like, then you've done something wrong, haven't you? It's like, it's just a bunch of stuff, junk. No, that would be a terrible outcome.
That's true.
So, yeah. But yeah, and in terms of conserving these things, I guess, we have to think about what it is that we're trying to conserve. not that this has ever happened to me, but if there was a blood stain on something, I wouldn't clean it off. Like, that is part of the object history.
Well, that was going to be my question. How much do we clean stuff? What would your reactions both be?
It's very difficult, and I think it's just such a on the fence answer, but it depends on the object, because you don't want anything to be contributing to further deterioration of the object. So say you've got a uniform that has sweat stains on it, for instance, and you might, a justification for trying to wash the sweat out is because it's acidic and might contribute to the fabric deteriorating. But then you might still have the coloration from the sweat, but you won't have the sweat there anymore. And I don't know what the answer is. It's one of those questions where it's like, they kind of might blow my mind a little bit, but you kind of have to think about the object and its preservation and what's best for that, as well as trying to serve the story and what it's telling. And it's again, it's a difficult balance, and I think it is like a case by case judgment on each object and how you proceed with it. I think, anyways. I don't know how you.
No, I think that's true, because so one of the first things that I had to treat when I started this job was that they'd put a machine gun on my lab table and said, well, we need this cleaned up for display.
Bam.
Also, we didn't have any way of mounting it, so I had to create this very sturdy, odd, thick plastisoap, like kind of mounting point for it, so it would be at the right angle and look vaguely right and stuff like that. And I approached that very differently to, say, some barbed wire from the trenches that I had recently, because ultimately I wouldn't really want to clean that. It's got mud on it. That's, it's from there.
Wow, what an amazing object.
But it was also falling apart because it was really, really rusty. And you may or may not agree with what I did, but I ended up consolidating all the mud on it and kept it as one object because it needed consolidation. And I just decided the mud is an important part of the object.
Yeah,
it is.
That's probably what I'd have done. Yeah.
So you may or may not agree with that, but it's what I did because I felt that was so intrinsic to why it was even an interesting piece of barbed wire, if you see what I mean. Because it is an interesting piece of barbed wire. So yeah, I think it's really, really dependent on context. Like, perhaps, no, I wouldn't say more than anywhere else, because ultimately all of our collections are important. But yeah, it depends.
These objects are used, aren't they? Like, 9 times out of 10, they've had a quite
a hard life.
Yeah, you kind of have to respect that and make a judgment on that object. It's really difficult.
And it's also one of these things of, obviously these things are often made to last. It was built to be dragged around, to be chucked around. And obviously we can take this, kind of full circle to, airplanes and tanks and, like really, really huge objects.
Can we talk about that? Can we talk about the practicalities? And I'll look at both of you, but I'm really interested. What do you have to deal with? Firstly, what space do you have to work with?
So I've got quite a nice lab space. It's quite big. There's reasonably good access to it with big double doors, and it's just me in there as well a lot of the time. So it's a decent space to work in. The stores we have are enormous. So we've got quite a vast collection of everything from vehicles to uniforms to paintings to edged weapons to archive material to medal. It's such a collection that. And some of those objects they wouldn't necessarily work in the lab space because they're too big, or, vehicles will kind of like stay where they are.
So it sounds like quite a lot of big bits of metal, but I'm interested in clothing, uniform, flags, banners.
Yep.
What do you have in the way of that, and how do you work with, say, the really large scale textile?
Yeah, so we have a collection of about 80,000 uniforms.
Oh my God.
What? 80,000? Jesus.
It's quite an amazing storage facility in terms of what it holds, because 80,000 is huge. They're stored in a combination of hanging in garment bags with padded hangers, and like heavier or more unstable objects are in kind of coffin boxes packed nicely. Our large textiles, we're really lucky actually, because when they got the stores fitted, they got a number of kind of bespoke rollers, like huge rollers in the racks, and so we have all these, like, we have a lovely space for rolling textiles basically. And we also have lots of enormous drawers, like flat drawers, which can accommodate quite big colours and flags as well. So the combination of those two really, it kind of covers our bases, which is quite nice. And then we have like hundreds of smaller drawers as well, which will accommodate smaller textiles. So yeah, we're like, it's a really, really nice storage facility in terms of our flat textiles.
It sounds like you have a sort of pipe dream storage facility,
well,
to be honest.
For some of us, yeah.
I mean, every storage facility, like no museum's storage facility is perfect, but yeah, we have a really nice big space, and we do have really like beautiful storage.
You know what that vaguely reminds me of? Speaking of storage spaces, I remember going as part of uni at some point. I went to the Fleet Air Arm Museum, which is amazing. It's wicked. And their storage facility
Where is that?
Beautiful. Vicky, help me out. Do you remember where it is? Yeovil? Yeah.
Oh, is it southwest-ish?
Yeah, it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's quite far away. Oh, well worth a visit, though. You have to have a car to get to it.
Well.
Which is one of those things, which is probably why I'll never see it again. But it was amazing. But yeah, it's an amazing facility, and they've got this huge building where they just keep all of these amazing pieces of vehicle, and obviously all the smaller stuff as well. But it being the Fleet Air Arm Museum, they have a ton of planes, right?
Yeah.
So many planes. And I remember being mesmerized, A, by their storage facilities, and B, by the kind of restoration work they were undertaking on these planes, right? Because it was very much the kind of place where you needed like engineers to be kind of trained in some conservation, and then you needed to work as a team because this, planes are huge. And then they were trying to do this thing where some of the planes, they were trying to strip back the kind of pristine paint that for a long time had been the kind of display standard, because people sometimes, the theory used to be that people go to see a plane looking as if it was new and about to take off into battle. And actually they thought that they would experiment with stripping back that paint and revealing the original paint layers, so you could see where it was patched, so you could see where it was scarred by bullets.
That sounds like the interesting stuff to me.
Yeah, so you could really see what a hard life the plane had. And I absolutely loved that project. It was absolutely amazing to see, and like the guy who was heading it was talking to us, and it was fantastic. That place is well worth a visit, by the way, if anyone's keen on planes, because that was so cool. Also, I bought the best teddy bear ever in their shop.
They do it for the planes on display, so it means visitors can see like the work going on. These kind of they call it paint archaeology, I think.
Yes.
Don't they?
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's so cool.
Yeah, it's very, very cool.
So I love that kind of thing, right? You just kind of, just peeling back the paint layers, and it's so amazing. And then you can see how dented and dinged and messed up it is because it was in use. That's so much more of a testament to the history of the object, as opposed to this is what it would have looked like when it was all pristine and when it would have taken off for the first time on its maiden voyage.
This is what it looked like in the catalogue.
Yeah, it is a bit like that. This is what it looked like in the catalogue, which, I feel like has, well, to me anyway, as a punter, that has less value than seeing it.
I feel like it's been done. We've done the sort of early 90s museum where everything is shiny and
also that's kind of what a reconstructed model is for.
Yeah, exactly.
I kind of feel like that fills that niche better. But yeah, that was a fantastic experience to go. So do go if you like planes, by the way.
So how do we feel about funding and the funding that's made available for military collections? Because I feel
that's a great question.
If you're talking about I say just because that's how some people see it, just social history collections.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of struggling social history collections around. Do you get the impression, ladies around the table, that big bucks are more available to large military collections because of the interest in large military collections?
I see what you're trying to say, but I think no, not in Britain at least.
Right.
Right. So something I was unaware of for a long time was that the Ministry of Defence actually helped fund regimental museums and military collections for a long time, and that has since ceased, so it no longer gets funding from the MOD. There are cuts everywhere, and that was just one of those things, right? So it went. Which means actually military museums tend to be struggling now.
Oh, right.
Probably more than we're aware. And that kind of means that alternative funding is really important. You can get some grants that are specifically for military museums, depending on what kind of museum you are. And they are done through the AMOT. That's what they're called for short. So there are some grants out there for military museums.
Okay.
But I think then ultimately a lot of it is becoming a fundraising game, like with everything else.
Oh, I see.
Where it's becoming a thing of, well, you know, please put a couple of pennies in the pot on your way out, and maybe think of us as a legacy, like maybe leave us money in your will, that sort of thing. Maybe if you feel like this is where your grandfather's stuff is, you can help us look after it by giving us money now, that sort of thing, right? So I think more and more it's leaning towards that. I don't necessarily know all that much about the funding models out there, but it used to get funding from the MOD and they don't anymore. So that's kind of where that's at, really. Much like any type of museum, also struggling. So, yeah.
What do you see in the way of donations from veterans, I suppose, and veterans' families? Because there are so many people who have been involved in regiments, military,
is that in terms of what kind of objects we see donated?
Yeah, kind of objects you see and kind of collections you see. So I imagine that much in the same way as loads of other collections, you get, you know, so-and-so collected this sort of thing, or so-and-so was passionate about this because of an involvement, collected it, and then following so-and-so's death, their family has said, museum, look at this, would you like it? And I imagine that because military collections are such a specific type of collection, that will happen quite a lot. Do you see that happen, do you think?
So we do get a lot of donations for the military collection, and they are a mix of so-and-so has passed away and we as a family thought this might be the best thing. And sometimes it's just older persons coming in and saying, look, I was a part of this and I still remember this and I would like you to have my things because my children aren't actually interested.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they would just put it in a charity bag by mistake and that sort of thing. So you kind of get both of those. And then it tends to be a mixture of archival materials, that's photographs and letters and train passes, you know, all sorts of great ephemera, essentially. People's uniforms, we get a lot of uniforms. We get a lot of medals. Less often we might get a weapon of some sort. But yeah, I think it's mostly the little bits of paper and the medals. The
bits
medals
and pieces
are a huge
that's
thing.
easier to keep.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, exactly.
What do you find?
Yeah, much the same really in terms of donations. We have a collections development group. We'll discuss it and work out if it fits in with our collections development policy, and then we'll go forward from there. But very similar to Jenny, a lot of archival material, a lot of photographs, uniforms, medals. We do acquire artwork as well, oil paintings, you know.
So how do you say no? So the direction I'm coming from, I suppose, is the fact that this sort of collection, this sort of object is very, very emotionally charged. And I'm imagine that a family decision to, say, donate grandfather's hat or husband's hat would be a very, very difficult thing to do. And then tactfully saying no, kindly saying no. How is that managed?
So much like Vicky was saying, we also have what we call an acquisition and disposal panel, which discusses anything that is offered to us to become part of the collection. And whilst we often say yes when it comes to the military collections, there might occasionally be reason for us to say no. But then it tends to be because it might be that we've already got many of this exact thing. If it's a very common type of uniform and it's not in particularly good nick, then it would be so much effort to try to look after that. But then, you know, you can't turn around to a family and go, it's too much effort looking after your thing. But then it might, in fact, be the sensitive thing to say is, actually, we already have 6 identical uniforms and we just can't take on a 7th. But then we might actually make a recommendation that these people might want it instead if you definitely don't want it. So we always try to facilitate that someone else might be interested. So at no point are we turning anyone away in a kind of a harsh no, never kind of way. It's always with a reason, also with a suggestion for where to go next. And that where to go next can be, actually, you might need to look at a different regimental museum because actually they weren't actually part of this one. It just looked
More
like they were,
relevant,
or like that might have been misread, or just because they lived in this geographical area doesn't mean that they served in this regiment. In actual fact, in the document it says this, so go here instead. We always try to facilitate them going away feeling like they've been valued, their object has been looked at, and like there is somewhere to go, rather than go home and put it in a charity bag, because nobody wants to hear that.
No.
So yeah. But often we do take the things that come in because they form a unique part of the story, because I guess we try to make sure that we gather the story that goes with it. So if possible, it's not just a medal, it's a medal that was received for this reason by this person on this date because of this story, and then it was actually because his mate did that thing, and then and the more story you can get with a military object, the better. And it's true for any object. The better it is, the more likely it is to be accepted. So it's all of those things, but we try not to turn people away without giving them some guidance for what they can do.
Oh yeah, no, Jenny, you just summed it up exactly as it is at NAM as well. There'll always be like often the object might not be suitable for our collection, but it will be suitable with a regimental museum or a different national. So we'd kind of like give feedback on that.
So I just wanted to bring in an example of something I saw done elsewhere, really, because I've gushed about Fleet Air Arm Museum and stuff like that. So I thought I'd gush a bit about something I saw on the other side of the planet, which was actually 2 places in New Zealand where I was early this year. One was at Te Papa, and it was the Gallipoli exhibition.
Oh, wow.
Which is immense. So again, I'm going to cite my cultural background of not being particularly invested in any of these conflicts. Means that if you make me care, you have done one hell of a job. And I came out of there crying.
Oh.
I mean, that was immense. So the Gallipoli exhibition, which is running until April next year. So if you're ever on that side of the planet, or if you're a listener there, go and see it. So it's this strange mixture of regular museum objects presented in a fantastic way. And, all the fancy displays that you could possibly want. It's very well done. Mixed with giant oversized models, sculptures of men and actually women in the trenches, very much in the midst of battle. They're made by, it's a Peter Jackson studio, I want to say that, so people who do movie props and like amazing sculptures. So they're human beings, but they are so much larger than you are. So you can see every pore on their face, and and they are so well made. They are immense. So you're standing there, each soldier or nurse or whatever it is that's going on in front of you, each diorama has a dedicated room. So you go from a bit of exhibition into a room with a diorama, and there's just this enormous person in front of you. And they look so lifelike, like they're about to reach out and touch you. And they are so emotional. Because there's people, at their breaking points in the midst of battle, or crying because they've received a letter. They are amazingly emotional, and they have some voice acting with them and stuff. So it's almost a cinematic kind of experience. And there are benches, so you can just sit down and hang out with them because they feel like real people. They're based on real people. They've got the photos and stuff of all the people they are based on. So in some ways they are real, and you can sit down and just kind of sit there and contemplate with them for as long as you need. They recommend at least an hour in this exhibition. I think we spent 3.
Oh, wow.
Which is, I think, a record for me in any exhibition. So it's just kind of museum-y bit, giant diorama, museum-y bit, giant diorama. But the level of emotional investment they managed to get out of you with these amazing lifelike, but bigger than life people is immense, and I've never seen anything like it. And I guess this is taking immersive kind of exhibitions to a whole new level, and I'd never seen it so well done. And they made me care about a conflict where I had no ancestors. This has nothing to do with me, but it was immense, and I felt so strongly about these people. I don't know, I felt like I came away emotionally scarred, which is beautiful. Aww. And similarly, they did a really great thing somewhere called the Omaka Heritage Aviation Centre, where they had a similar approach, and actually part of the same studio had done some of these things, where they'd reconstructed, again, they mixed traditional museum style things with reconstructions. So they had planes with people climbing in or out of them, but these were life-size as opposed to larger than life, but still very well made. People working on them, people being shot down, people being dragged out because they were injured. They made it come to life in a way that I've never seen before. And again, they had the photos and the stuff where it said like, this is based on this photo. And you can see that it's the same people, that they've just made 3-dimensional right there in front of you. And it became so emotional. And because they'd brought in soundscapes and all this stuff, it made it real in a way that history is very difficult to make when you just look in a case with a uniform and a letter. Because whilst that can be emotional in and of itself, it can sometimes be difficult to kind of get that across if you don't have an immediate connection with the person in the case. So I just thought these were fantastic examples of immersive and very kind of modern exhibitions. Obviously,
amazing.
They must have cost the earth to make. I cannot imagine. And also they had the space to kind of sprawl out and do that, which most places won't. But it was amazing to see, and it was really cool, and I haven't seen it done anywhere else, and I just wanted to bring it up as a kind of very immersive experience that was very well made. So today we're talking about military collections, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to talk to someone who does something a little bit different from what we might be used to. Ian, would you like to introduce yourself and your channel and your website?
Sure. My name is Ian McCollum, and I run, well, it started as just a website and then turned into primarily a video channel called Forgotten Weapons. And the whole idea was to archive information about mostly experimental and prototype firearms. The idea started about 8 years ago when I had some mutual friends who had come up with some really relevant and interesting documentation on some World War I pattern firearms. And they passed away, and their family didn't recognize the significance of what they had dug out of the French archives or dug out of the garbage when a lot of this stuff was being thrown away by factories. And they just threw it away themselves. And it's information that probably will never come back to light. I don't think we'll ever find another copy of it. Yeah. And I figured, it's too bad no one's doing anything to preserve this. So I started a website to do just that. And then over the years, it has turned into primarily a video channel, because it turns out video is a much easier way to explain mechanical systems than photographs and text.
Yeah, quite.
So it's gotten larger than I ever expected. I have a little over 900,000 YouTube subscribers at this point.
Wow.
And I did not anticipate that when I started it. But I publish a video every single day. And so, of course, that requires spending a substantial amount of time filming. Yeah. And I've developed relationships with both commercial companies, primarily auction house companies, and then also private collectors and museums, which is, I think, most relevant here today.
Yes, that's right. So I think of you as a YouTube historian and researcher. Would you say that's an accurate description?
I feel a little awkward calling myself a researcher because what I do at the volume of video content that I produce, I do very little. I do basically no original research. I have an extensive library that I work from. I would love to do more archival research, but it would require a change in my fundamental format. And there are people out there who do a much, much more thorough job of digging into the really deep history behind different guns. But I don't think it's too unhumble to say that I do put out more actual factual historical content than most people in this sort of area.
I've seen your videos shot at Leeds Royal Armouries here in the UK. What other collaborations have you done with museums out there?
The other museums that I've worked with are the Dutch Military Museum. I've done a little bit of work with the Danish Army Museum in Copenhagen, the Firearms Museum here in the U.S. Also, I've done a little bit with the Rock Island Arsenal Museum here in the U.S. I was going to say museums can kind of be more difficult for me to work with. So I have really worked with more private collectors than I have museums. And I'm sure that's something that we'll get into here.
Yeah, absolutely. So out of curiosity, how do you get in touch with the private collectors?
Almost all word of mouth. It's usually people who see my videos, and often it's firsthand. I find private collectors often have an easier decision-making process. It's one person who just has to decide that this sounds like an interesting thing to do, and presto, it's authorized and it happens. Organizations can be a lot more bureaucratic and difficult to work with.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, when I do museums, I have to plan substantially in advance.
So how have you reached out to these museums that you have worked with, and who did you deal with when you were there?
It really depends on the individual circumstances. A couple, let's see, with the Cody Museum, actually, I got in touch with the curator directly over Facebook. We had some mutual friends, and she maintains a very active presence on Facebook and is very easy to get a hold of. And because the Cody Museum is private, that simplifies things a bit. With most of the other museums internationally, what I've ended up doing is kind of putting out a request among my friends or among my fans for, does anyone have a contact at this museum? And so usually that'll end up in some sort of PR or media department. And ones that have been most successful are ones where either someone in PR or media is a fan of the channel. Yeah. And they kind of take it upon themselves to push for this to happen within the organization. Or ones where I can actually make a personal connection to the curator. If I can get to talk to the curator and develop a personal friendship, that, for obvious reasons, that really smooths the process of being able to film there.
Yeah, quite. When you were actually on site and finally made it to these museums, who did you feel like you were dealing with? Was it primarily the maybe initial contact or the curators or other people behind the scenes?
It's mostly the curators, but it's generally a complete surprise to me. Walking into a museum the first time to do something like this, I have no idea who I'm going to be talking to, what their position is. Often, even in email correspondence beforehand, it can be a little bit difficult to ascertain what is a person's actual role based on their title or their communications. So you really just have to play it by ear and be flexible.
When you have visited these places, were you shown how things were stored or given any handling instructions, or were you kind of left in a room with some guns and then, and, how about it?
It's been a bit of both, but museums generally have pretty strict regulations on supervision. They don't want to leave weird strangers alone with their artifacts, which I completely understand. So usually, in fact, I think pretty much always I have at least one handler there with me, just keeping an eye on what I'm doing. And how smoothly the visit goes often depends on how familiar that handler is with firearms. One thing that I do in particular is take stuff apart. And so there's always a feeling out process of how comfortable is the organization or the individual with disassembly of the guns. If they are guns that those people are familiar with, that makes a difference. If those people are gun people themselves, particularly in the United States for obvious reasons, if whoever's working with me, if they've got their own collection and they are avid shooters themselves, they're typically much more comfortable with guns being taken apart because they understand how that works, and that this isn't like trying to disassemble the spine of an ancient manuscript. Guns are meant to be disassembled, and they're designed so they can come apart and go back together. As long as you exercise due care in the process, nothing's going to break. Museums always require gloves as well, which is kind of private collectors virtually never have any interest in using gloves. The auction companies never use gloves. Yeah, by the way, museums that stock gloves never stock ones that actually fit. Ever.
That is also a problem. Did you feel that you've had positive experiences at these institutions as a general rule?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, all of them. I've never really had a bad experience at a museum. The worst thing that has ever happened to me is not having as much time as I would like. But beyond that, I've generally found museum staff to be very friendly, very outgoing, and willing to help with what I'm doing. And when there are times when they don't want to disassemble something, it's not outrageous. It's understandable. And there are certainly guns that I, on my own, look at and opt not to disassemble, especially something that's in really completely pristine condition. I don't want to be the guy that puts the first scratch on it somewhere. So I will, and not just in museums, but in other collections as well. I'll just let it be as it is.
Yes. Using common sense at all times, basically.
It goes a long way.
How could your experiences have been made better, do you think? What could have been improved?
By far the biggest obstacle I have working with museums is finding out what they have. In general, I regard anything that's actually displayed in the museum as out of my purview. The problem then is what I will typically do is I'll contact a museum, and let's say it goes great. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. We'll have you can come out for like 3 days, all day. We've got a room that's good for filming. It's quiet. It's got good light. What do you want to film? And I kind of have to answer, well, what do you have? Because if I haven't been there before,
how would you know? Yeah.
I have no idea. And I have found most museums have an extremely poor catalog system, or at least an extremely poor one that's available for them to send to the public. There are catalogs out there where like a third of the catalog will have some pictures, which is great. But then 2/3 of the catalog will have items that are, item 1, 2, 3, 4, experimental grenade launcher. And so what I find is that the best way to actually do a museum visit is to go twice. If I can come up with a couple items that I know that they have and arrange just a one-day visit and say, well, you've got this gun and that gun, and I'd like to film those two. Show up for one day, do those two guns, and then use that opportunity to also get a tour of what's in the reserve collection. Oh. And then I can take notes on my own of, the Canadian War Museum has this, and this, and that's what I'd like to come back and do. And then I can schedule a second trip 6 months later or a year later and actually know what I'm coming to look at.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. There is a problem that a lot of museums suffer from, that they don't have particularly good databases, and even their own records might not be super duper up to scratch, which is a bit tragic, but we're working on it.
And I don't want to sound like I'm coming down negative on museums, but the other issue is curators often really don't know anything about the collections. This is probably exacerbated by the fact that I tend to specialize in really obscure stuff. With a private collector, I can usually depend on the collector to know something about the history of each item, because since it's their personal property, they have a vested interest in learning about it. And the people who are contacting me are typically collectors who are curious, want to know more about the guns that they have and where they came from. Museums tend to have, they probably had some guy like that at some point.
Yes.
As new staff comes and goes, especially in larger institutions, there are a lot of people who are there because it's a job. And they do their job great. They keep the guns in good order. Things don't get stolen, things don't degrade, but they're not adding to the museum's archive of information and understanding of the collection.
Yeah. See, arguably, I think that's kind of where this sort of exchange is so important, because whilst obviously it's a huge hurdle for you to not have that expertise on hand, on the other hand, it might also be a really wonderful opportunity for the museum to receive more information.
So I don't consider a visit, whether it's a private collector or a museum, I don't consider it completely successful unless whoever runs the collection or owns the collection has learned something in the process as well. That's what gives them a motivation to have me come back.
Oh, that's a great attitude. I love that. That's fantastic. How do you think museums can better facilitate the kind of work that you and other historians out there do you think?
In large part, I think it would be by being more public about what they have. That and having a clear channel of communication. Like, how do you find the person who can authorize something like this? I think a lot of museums are very, very touchy about having anyone from the outside come in for anything other than whatever the standard experience of the public side of the museum is.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out what kind of organization is there? What are the circumstances for coming in as a private individual to see things that are in the reserve and actually touch them, take them apart, do research in the museum? These tend to be things that there are people who have figured it out and they become very, intimately acquainted and familiar with the museum. But for someone on the outside trying to do that for the first time, it can be very difficult to figure out, who do I talk to? Like, what records do you even have? Especially if we're talking archival records, written records. How do I know if I need to come in here and research, if I need to visit your museum for whatever research project I'm working on? If I can't if I can't figure out what you have, it's kind of a catch-22.
Yeah. Okay, so probably communicate better with what you've got, and communicate better once you've established contact with who you're talking to and who you need to talk to. And also clear contacts on your website will be super.
Yeah. A section of for researchers, something along those lines.
Yeah.
Give us a place to start, at least.
Yes, that would be very good, wouldn't it?
It would be nice if there was the beginning of some path, just like one signpost somewhere to get you started, to be able to actually use the museum for research.
Well, Ian, thank you so much for talking to the C Word today. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sure it was a lot of fun.
If you're enjoying the C Word and would like to support our work, then please consider becoming one of our patrons. For as little as $1 per month, you can help us keep our episodes online and more of them coming. Patreon helps us meet our regular costs for the show, and also to plan ahead so we know roughly how much of a monthly budget we've got. That's super helpful when you're trying to do something special like buy a better microphone or save up to go to a special event. Your support also helps keep us free of advertisement. In return, our supporters get access to our archive of extended episodes, which you can only access on our Patreon page. Yeah, for that $1 a month, you get a little extra audio enjoyment. We've crunched the numbers, and it's about 10% extra content on a regular basis. Well, that's not bad for less than a cup of coffee, eh? If supporting us sounds like something you'd like to do, then head over to patreon.com/thecword and join our bunch of absolute champions. Thanks for listening. We're The C Word, and you've been listening to Vicky Singleton, Kloe Rumsey, and me, Jen Mathiasson. Join us next time for an episode about natural history. In the meantime, check out our website at thecword.show, tweet us at The C Word Podcast, or simply email us on thecwordpodcast@gmail.com. The intro and outro music is Spring by Didi Music, used under Creative Commons Attribution License. Additional music and sound effects by Callum Robertson. This has been a Wooden Dice production.